Let's now look at Mike Winger's point 11, or 10, depending on which list you have from his video, comparing the Passion narrative of Jesus with verses from Psalm 22. Here, Mike is addressing verses 16 and 17 from the Psalm, which read, "Dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me." Now, we've already examined verse 16 and its rendering of pierced, so what Mike is asserting now is that these verses describe whatever event has befallen the individual Psalm 22, it is occurring in front of a hateful crowd. But he isn't just asserting this is an unknown event, he specifically asserts this is an execution. If you read Psalm 22 in its own context, you'll be forgiven if you, like myself, do not read anything about an execution occurring in these verses. Dogs surround the individual in these verses, as do a pack of evildoers, or perhaps demonic spirits, as we discussed in our last episode. The person's bones are said to be on display, and people are staring and gloating over the person in the psalm. Now, if you're reading these verses as a Christian apologist does, with a Bible in one hand and perhaps some medieval painting of the crucifixion in the other, then you already have a conclusion in mind. Psalm 22 is about Jesus, and you're fooled into believing an execution is what these verses are describing. You've already decided that's what the psalm is about, and you'll fit these verses around your conclusion. But there's nothing here about an execution. What has the psalmist stated he has done, or what has he been accused of, that brings him to this situation? Executions, such as crucifixion, were done to punish lawbreakers and political malcontents. Where in Psalm 22 has any wrongdoing, justified or otherwise, by the psalmist been suggested as having occurred which brought the psalmist to this sorry state? Again, remember the psalm is about a person who has been suffering over a prolonged period of time. There is no cause associated with the individual's circumstances. We've already discussed that it is likely he or she has been suffering from an illness. The verses here seem to support such a reading over and above describing a public execution. They describe suffering from perhaps a prolonged illness, a feeling of abandonment by God, a feeling as though being at death's door, with people surrounding to take advantage of this exaggerated, weakened state. In the ancient world, superstition played a huge part in daily life. The world was filtered through a supernatural lens. So if a person were found in unfortunate circumstances, it would not have been unusual for many people to think that the sufferer had somehow come to deserve their fate. And the worse off you were, the more you were thought to have done something exceptionally bad to earn that fate. Think of the biblical book of Job for an example. Saying his suffering, his friends accused him of some sort of wrongdoing to deserve what was happening to him. One states, "Consider now, who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it." So too in verse 17 of Psalm 22. The subject has been ill for such an extended period of time, crying out to God by day and by night without an answer, unable, it seems, to keep any food down as he is poured out like water, with his heart melting into his bowels, that he has emaciated to the point that all his bones are on display. People seeing this are probably horrified and stare at him, but at the same time believe he must have done something to deserve this fate, and so gloat over him. And all this can be occurring without an execution being necessary, and, in fact, fits much better with what Psalm 22 actually says. If the psalm really were about execution, wrongful execution as would parallel the gospel narratives, where is the language? Christian apologists love vague prophecy, and you could have that in Psalm 22 while still making it clear that what is being described is probably an execution. There needn't be a verse about being brought to a trial, but where is one stating something to the effect of being falsely accused? There needn't be a verse about flogging, but where is one stating something like being brought by false accusers to the dust of death? There needn't be a verse about being hung from a tree, but where is there any sense that what is occurring as a source of punishment? Such verses don't exist, so the apologist has to assume an execution and then stretch what remains to fit over the passion narrative of Jesus. But as we've just seen, that isn't necessary if one simply allows the psalm to speak for itself. So Mike's point 11, or 10, asserting that verses 16 and 17 of Psalm 22 are describing a public execution like the one Jesus suffered in the gospel narratives, just doesn't hold water when looked at in more detail. As apologists are wont to do, Mike is reading far more into the verses, driven to do so by his preconceived conclusion that the psalm must be about Jesus, than the native context of the verses allow.